All right. Real pleasure to welcome to the program writer from the New Republic, Osita Nwanevu. Osita, welcome to the program. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, frankly. I think I had mentioned to you, maybe since almost a year ago, I think you had written something to the effect of, I can't, but it was, end the GOP, which I think is, that's worn well past year. But let's talk about it in the context of this week, because about a week ago or so ago, you were writing in anticipation of the importance of impeachment. Articulate for us why impeaching the Republican, or I should say, the president was important, but the broader implications of it.
Sure. So, I think that everybody can basically agree, and every rational person can agree that Trump is culpable for what happened last week, that he deserves to be impeached. But as was the case, I think, for the first impeachment that happened, I don't think that's really sufficient as an answer to the place the country is in right now. Trump, as again, I think rational people can understand, is the sort of symptom of larger problems. And one of the big problems we have is the fact that we have a Republican Party in this country that is intensely reactionary. It's only gotten worse, visibly worse, over the past 10 years. And that is accruing structural power within our institutions. It's getting more powerful in the Senate. We won the Senate in this election, but in terms of the way the population of this country is distributed, over time, more and more of the seats are going to be in control of a smaller and smaller share of the population. Obviously, we know that it has structural power with the Electoral College, and we know that they've worked in state legislators to redraw congressional districts, to redraw state legislative districts to entrench their candidates. So those are all really big problems that I don't think getting rid of Trump is going to really help us solve. So what we need in this country, from my perspective, is a campaign. I don't know if you want to call it a campaign or sort of an ethical mission, whatever you want to call it, to actually disempower the Republican Party. Because if we allow things to continue on their current trajectory, it's only get more powerful as a party, and it's going to be very, very hard for us to avoid more of what happened on Wednesday.
We just had a story today. That Jeff Sessions was driving the family. They call it family separation policy. In my mind, it was just out and out kidnapping. But nevertheless, the point is that Jeff Sessions, median Republican, senator, essentially, when he was there, it was not like this guy's not some type of huge outlier. It's just that he saw an opportunity, I think, early on that Donald Trump was amenable to, one of his pet projects. But this is not a guy who was in some way, sort of perceived as some type of outlier in the Republican Party. I mean, to a large extent, the Republicans got what they wanted, which I think Grover Norquist had said, just give us a live hand that can sign stuff. And that's what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, if you pick any Republican who's now sort of held as being a model moderate, somebody who's a real beacon of light and a true conscience in the Trump era, pick any one of those people and you can find a precedent for what Trump is become in their former actions. Take somebody like Mitt Romney, who ran in 2012 with Paul Ryan on a campaign that was premised in part on the idea that Obama was waging this grand war on religion and American values, and they tried to otherize him and didn't explicitly buy into the birther stuff, but I think implicitly tried to tap into those same anxieties. Look at somebody like the late John McCain, who ran with Sarah Palin, who was the Trump, I think, in basically every respect. You can go all the way back to Reagan. We could be sitting here talking for an hour about Ronald Reagan. But there was apparently some revelation last year that he, had been engaged in very crude racism against Africans behind the scenes. So, everybody in the Republican Party on one level or another is if not directly complicit, certainly responsible for doing things that created this current political moment that we're in. And I think people have to reckon with that seriously.
Well, Joe Biden, as the president-elect and will be president in just a few days, he seems to embody the exact antithesis of what you're talking about. Just last week, he discussed how we need a strong opposition party. We need a strong Republican Party. And his whole campaign was predicated on the notion that Trump was this sort of outlier and that the fever would break. I mean, to borrow what was used during the Obama years, which he was obviously a part of. What does that say about the future of combating republicanism when the leader of the Democratic Party seems to find republicanism essential to governance?
Yeah, well, it says that we can't depend upon Joe Biden to lead the charge against the Republican Party. And we probably can't depend upon the Democratic Party either. I know that there are people who have, high hopes that there's going to be a gradual ideological transformation. But frankly, I think it's going to be up to activists, to people on the left, to really make the case to the American public that the Republican Party can't really be abided in its current form and with the amount of power it currently has. I don't think that you're going to see a lot of Democrats under the Biden administration say the things that ought to be said, say all the things that I've been saying today and in all of my writing. That's not what they're there to do, really. I think that the work is going to be public communication. It can't just be people on Twitter who know how bad the Republican Party is complaining about how bad the Republican Party is, right? There has to be some kind of breakthrough that we're making with the public, because actually, this is, I think, a mistake people on the left tend to make. There's this assumption that bipartisanship and compromise are sort of values that are held by elites in American politics that are disconnected from what people out there in the country actually feel. But no, like if you look at surveys, Democrats in particular genuinely value bipartisanship. They genuinely think compromise is a good idea because that's the only model of government that's ever been sort of sold to them. That's a model we've been operating under for the past 30, 40 years. And so somebody has to go out there and tell them the story of what the Republican Party is and how we can do things differently. Somebody has to go out and tell them why the filibuster is bad and why the Senate is bad in its current design. But those aren't really things that we can depend on Democratic politicians who exist within the current system to do for us. That's something that the left has to engage in as a project on its own.
Well, see, now this is, I mean, and I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I have made that point over and over again, that in many respects, the part of the problem is this desire for compromise that Democrats have. When I say Democrats, I'm talking about people who go and vote for Democrats in elections versus people who go out and vote for Republicans in elections. Now that's changed over the past five years or even 10 years, even prior to Trump. There was you could start to see in the polling a change. So there has been some of that has seeped out into the broader, but respond to this, which I think is also problematic. So back in the day, one of the problems to that agenda, or to completing that agenda, was that the Beltway media, if you will, was completely, their both siderism was huge. Now it's died down during the Trump administration, but I'm quite convinced it's going to return. But part of the problem is that it seems to me, and I hear that we can't rely on Joe Biden for this, but if the Democrats as the opposition party aren't publicly calling out the Republicans for these type of things, it's impossible to imagine that this media is going to do it too, right? Like that was the value to me about impeachment in the first place. It was basically saying, hey, we've been saying this is wrong and this is wrong, but now this is really wrong. We're impeaching him. And then you saw the numbers follow that because the Democrats were showing, not telling. And then the media could respond with they really think this is bad. How do we break that logjam without an oppositional party that is taking, because presumably, a lot of these people that you're talking about perceive politics as something that happens over there with these two players. And it's like, how can you watch a basketball game, be rooting for your team to win, and your team is just going maybe we shouldn't run up the score. Let's keep this close.
Well, it's a loser's mentality.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think your point about the media is very important, obviously, because I don't think we can really depend on on CNN and the other major outlets to deviate from his perspective either. The people who are sort of elevating Liz Cheney as the conscience of the nation right now, ultimately, I think that the answer, and maybe this isn't, a real and satisfying answer, is like the answer is like having 10 more majority reports, right? Like having more media outlets and having more ways to communicate with the public from our perspective that aren't filtered through a press that has a lot of reasons not to, have people break from the existing model of politics. That's the real answer. And so every time I hear that AOC or one of the progressives in Congress is doing something to communicate with, again, ordinary people who aren't as plugged into American politics, people who don't really know what's going on as much, I think we have to applaud that and say that there needs to be more of it, because that's ultimately the solution. I just don't think at this stage we can really believe that either the Democratic Party is an institution or the major institutions within the press are going to do this work for us. I just think that we have to sort of strike out on our own in every possible way.
And what are the way? I mean, aside from obviously, and I couldn't agree more on the 10 majority reports. I think, but I mean, aside from that, what are there other institutions that you look around that you think are particularly effective for something like that?
Well, I think the answer I always give about this is think about the conservative movement and what it's done over the past half century. It would have been very easy for conservatives to say after Barry Goldwater's loss in 1964, well, conservatism can't work in this country. There's not enough a constituency for it in the general public. It's going to get beaten in every election. We just have to turn to something else. That's not what they did. They got a lot of money and spent the decades between Goldwater and Reagan, establishing think tanks, establishing publications, establishing different groups that reached out to people in suburbia and tried to get them to cotton to conservative ideology. And that was a multi-decade long process, but it got the goods. It did engender a change in the ideological makeup of the American electorate. And I think that's ultimately what the left has to do. People hear these kinds of conversations and think, well, that means we just need to start a new party, right? And that's what we need, a third party that's going to be left, and we're going to run elections. There are like 12 left-wing parties already in this country, and nobody's ever heard of, right? Because that was the solution that they thought was going to do the thing as well. I think that we have to think a little bit more in a more sophisticated way about things. It has to be a movement that we're building with different kinds of institutions that are built to meet different kinds of needs. And a lot of those needs are not going to be electoral. They're not going to be about running this or that person in a primary race, although that's going to be very important. They're going to be, how can we go to places where the left is very weak right now, in rural America, in places that we think are, sort of deep red conservative? And what can we do over time to get people reading some things that we think are going to be influential and that they should inform the way they think about the economy? What can we do to get them think differently about issues that they believe are already familiar to them, and sort of defamiliarize them and make them open to new thinking? That's a big kind of abstract project. And it's something that I think is going to take a really long time, and development of all kinds of different bodies, groups, institutions.
How much do you think that's going to accelerate as a function of generational change? I mean, I think we are literally, we are right on the cusp of a massive generational shift, it seems to me, particularly within the Democratic Party. I just remind people, Nancy Pelosi has been the Democratic leader in the House for almost 2 decades now. And if not 2 decades. And during that time, I think there's been a half a dozen Republican leaders of the House in one form or another. I'm not talking necessarily Speaker of the House, but in terms of majority leaders, our president is well into his 70s. We're about to see a big generational switch from the boomers and I guess even the silent generation to the next powerhouse is going to jump over my generation right to the millennials, just because of the sheer numbers of these people. And that generation seems to be far more open to an understanding of politics as more combative, and B, an understanding of, an ideological predisposition that is far more open to socialistic and socialism, I guess, policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the numbers now and the breakdown of political views by age, there's reason maybe for optimism, but weird things happen in history. I don't think that's a sure thing. I think we should remember that just in November, we saw this thesis about Hispanics and the great demographic transition there being something that would be really, really helpful for Democrats, really challenged in, I think, a significant way. So these different demographic groups, whether we're talking about young people or different racial groups, you know, anything that we see happening there is going to be fixed to this particular moment in time, and there's going to be a potential for change in the future. So I think there's reason to believe that the electorate is moving to the left. I don't know that we can see that shift, or that we can expect to see that shift continue at the same rate that's been happening now. I don't know that precludes possibility that we could see a shift to the right for certain reasons. It's all kind of up in the air and amorphous right now. But I think that the real work we have to do has to be done without any kind of expectation that the work is going to be done for us by, just time alone. In part because we don't really have a lot of time to solve the issues that we're facing as a country. You can think that there's going to be this demographic transition that gets us to comprising a majority of the Democratic electorate in the 2030s or the 2040s. And then we were going to elect a socialist candidate or whatever. Well, on a climate timeline, that doesn't really matter. Like we have the time we're being given right now to address that problem. It's not going to help people who are struggling right now. So anything we can do to sort of accelerate the extent to which we have influence, I think is going to be really, really important.
So you talk about the project of conservatism after Goldwater's loss and how they basically expanded all their think tanks and their entire apparatus, magazines, National Review gained prominence, other things like that. And a lot of that infrastructure remains to this day. And the roadblock that comes to mind is just that there's so much more money on the conservative side of things to build the kind of project that you're talking about, to reach people in those specific ways. Whereas if there's money on the Democratic side, it's often to fund the exact tendencies that frustrate us, like the bipartisanship, the kind of empty promises that don't have staying power. What's your response to that, and what's your opinion of that dynamic?
Well, absolutely, conservatives have this sort of stable reserve of cash they can use for these kinds of projects. But I don't think people should discount the amount of money that people on the left have been able to sort of access and create for themselves over the past 10 years. Look at the Bernie Sanders campaign. Look at all of the small dollar donations and what they were able to do. It's just a matter of spending that kind of money wisely, making sure that we're not dumping $100 million to try to elect Amy McGrath, or something. It's making sure that all the resources we do have are being used in creative ways that we think are going to be, to put a crack in the firmament of things and not sort of dumping it down the tubes. That would be a good place to start. But yeah, it's true the conservatives have a lot of money. But I don't think that is something that we should see as an insurmountable challenge for us.
We need to give more money to the Lincoln Project if we want to achieve. I mean, that's a fine example of money that, and I appreciate that there are people out there, I am happy to have people criticize Donald Trump, but to fund them to that level is not going to get you to the place that you want to be if you are looking for some type of legislative action by Democrats that is, more akin to what FDR would do rather than, let's say, Mitt Romney would have done. But with that said, to what extent, and I want to circle back. Well, let me just follow on this. The other thing that fueled this rise, and certainly I think it's one of the sort of one of the stories obscured by Donald Trump on some level, but also brought into relief with Donald Trump, is the self-identified Christian right in this country. You can call it a bunch of other things, and its relationship, frankly, to both authoritarianism and an authoritarianism that came out of the South. I mean, there's, it's not the Venn diagram of the self-identified evangelical Christian that circle and the circle of authoritarianism that, has been studied in this country. 25% of North Americans are considered to be authoritarians. And that last circle of, states that seceded from the Union. That Venn diagram is, it's pretty shaded. Let's put it that way. I mean, there's a little bit on the margins.
It's a circle.
But I mean, where does that exist on the left? I mean, there is no cohesion like that. I mean, you can take maybe 65% of those people fall within that. There's nothing like that in the Democratic coalition, is there?
I don't really think so. Conservatism has always been, it's been internally contradictory if you look at the ideology, but there's been institutions that kind of bind people together, and the Christian right, obviously, and the churches have been a big part of that. Now we have churches, obviously, as well. The Black church is going to be a huge part of democratic politics, I think, well into the future. But you're right that there's not really much of a binding agent for all of the different constituencies within the Democratic coalition. Beyond, I think, now just sort of the fear of what happens if Republicans take over. Okay, we disagree about X, Y, and Z. We're not very alike in a lot of ways, but look, like the Republican control, or I guess in this presidency, Donald Trump is such a threat that we all have to come together, set that aside, and operate as a unit. When it comes to actually doing constructive policy, that's a problem, right? Because you're not being animated by a specific, total kind of vision that everybody shares for the way the country has to go. I think that you saw the Bernie Sanders campaign, and really him as a political figure, that all of that was kind of an effort to create this, to tell a story about the American economy, who has power and who doesn't. Everybody can relate to, everybody could understand is true, and that would be, a binding kind of force. Obama was good at this sort of civic nationalism, this kind of telling a story about America that everybody can see themselves in. And that was kind of a binding agent. And Biden is trying to do the same thing, but I think the problems are so deep, and people understand now that they're so deep, that I don't know if he can do that in a really, really compelling way. He's certainly not as gifted as an orator as Obama was. He's not as gifted as a communicator. So we'll see, now over the course of this presidency, how well he's able to succeed in resurrecting that bond. But whether or not he does, I think it's up to the left now to sort of, again, present a different kind of narrative, to present a story that everybody within the coalition can sort of see themselves within and understand is true, and use as an animating force for our political objectives.
Substantively speaking, I think the real question is going to be, to what extent did Biden, as a member of the Obama administration, I think this is, and I should say, I'll preface it by saying there's certain limitations as to what we can expect, and I think you certainly have read, I should say written, or I've read of yours, that it would be a mistake for the left to have certain expectations of Biden in terms of who he's going to put into his cabinet and what he's going to do, and not to be mistaken for not to have demands, but also don't kid yourself. The real question in terms of what he's going to be able to provide to the left and how far the left is going to be able to push him in this country is going to be, it seems to me, a function as a completely purely practical political consideration. To what extent are they going to make the same mistakes that they claim that they made under the Obama administration, which was to misinterpret or to assume that Republicans were operating in good faith. It's still unclear to me. I think we'll know in a couple, just after this, the whole $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill, how savvy they are to what they can really expect from Republicans. And so going forward. But with that said, you touched on this about third parties, and I'm curious as to your perspective, because there is, and this is sort of narrow, but we're talking about the left in this regard, and about the 10 majority reports that are out there. There is a sort of a nascent sections of the to a large extent, the online left. But if we're talking about communications, we have to recognize that, Twitter may not be real life, but it is real life, A, and B, a lot of media people are on there. And so it shapes some narratives. There is, like, on the online, certain corners of this online, arguably left, there are attacks on like the Squad and the Justice Democrats as being insufficiently committed to, I don't know, certain strategic or tactical maneuvers. Like, give me your take on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's wrong to try to, hold people in Congress accountable, whether they're, people who've declared themselves as socialists or people who are sort of ordinary Democrats. I think it makes sense to hold everybody's feet to the fire and make sure that they're keeping the promises that have been made. That's not really an issue for me. I do sort of wonder how useful it is to try to, psychoanalyze these people and do this kind of critique where you're always assuming that there is some kind of ulterior motive in the background that's pulling, puppeteering everything that you're seeing happen. I think that people in the Squad are better in most respects, or in every respect, than the average Democratic member of Congress. But I think that there's going to be places over the course of the next few years where there are going to be legitimate critiques to be made of those people, and there are going to be questions that we're going to have to ask. I just think that we should be sane and not, veer into a kind of emotionality about who they are and what they're doing. That would be my only take. I don't think it's wrong to criticize AOC or to say AOC should be doing this or that, but
What do you think about? I mean, just I guess this phenomena of misinformation and of the tendency of, I think that type of critique and that analysis is a function of, the nature of shows like mine on some level, which are, some hybrid between, what we see as television news and talk radio on some level, where, and some of the worst stuff that we have in this country has come from talk radio. That is good, but some of the worst tendencies that we have are born of this medium. Where do you think all that goes, and how do we deal with that from a just sort of a purely from having a sort of a functioning democracy?
Yeah, I just think it's important for us not to be too insular. Going back to what I was talking about before, one of the reasons why talk radio and things that resemble talk radio can be bad is that you're a group of people who are like each other, talking to each other all the time, and not talking to anybody sort of outside of the bubble, and sort of losing your ability to communicate with a person who is not, let's say, on Twitter 18 hours a day. That is where a lot of the neuroses set in. So I think it's important, again, to develop channels of communication that will allow us to talk to people who are not already in our camp, and people who are not really into politics even. I think that's the healthiest way to go about things. A conversation with a normal person who has not been on Twitter, I think I have found to be a very sort of restorative mental practice for myself personally. I think would probably be good for the movement as a whole.
What do you think we can expect in terms of how do you think this is going to play out with Biden's relief package?
Well, it's interesting because I think that what we've seen in the proposal so far is a lot of things that can be done through budget reconciliation, which is a process. It's a little complicated, but it's a process where you can bypass the filibuster to pass certain kinds of bills that are spending related. A lot of what we saw in the package that Biden proposed can be done through that. But at least one very big thing cannot, and that's the $15 minimum wage. That is something that you have to pass through the conventional legislative process because it's not a spending provision.
Has that been established yet? Because I've seen it go both ways. I think we need. I think literally this is one of those things where the parliamentarian of the Senate has to make a ruling on this, right? Because the argument that it might drive revenue, but that it may drive revenue, which impacts the budget, but that it's incidental. It really, my understanding is it's almost a function of, and this is how I think that, it's hard for people to sort of to grok on some level. who gets appointed to the Congressional Budget Office and how they decide to score the implications of the $15 minimum wage, which is ostensibly a nonpartisan position, the CBO is, but just their perspective on what numbers are important could impact that outcome as to whether it can be part of reconciliation or not.
It could. I mean, it's dicey because the Byrd rule, which is the thing that governs reconciliation, is not just a Senate rule. It's actually like embedded within the law in some respects, and it gets complicated. I think that the thing to sort of hold as a guiding principle, though, I think in these kinds of conversations, is that although Democrats should take whatever opportunity is given to them to stretch the rules and push as much through as they can, you don't want to be in a situation where the $15 minimum wage is actually illegal, right? This is something that can be struck down with a lawsuit or some kind of intervention by Republicans, right? You want it to be done as in a way that is unchallengeable as possible. That goes for all the things that Democrats are going to hope that they accomplish over the course of Biden's term. So we'll see. We'll see. I think that there's going to be a moment of truth on the filibuster probably fairly soon, whether it's a $15 minimum wage or something else. And it'll be incumbent upon progressives, activists to sort of make it clear to the party, not because they hope it's going to change, and undergo this big ideological transformation, but to make it clear to the party that if you want to be reelected in 2022, if you want to hold your seat wherever you are in your next election, it's going to be extremely important that you vote to eliminate this procedural rule, you bring the Senate to a more democratic place, and you allow the democratic agenda to move forward. That's the big task.
I mean, I think that's I guess it's going to come down to that, and I think on some level we're also going to get a sense of whether Biden is if this nod to bipartisanship is a head fake or just a bluff call, essentially.
Well, that's my question then is what's your sense of, because Biden is actually seemingly responding to some of that progressive pressure with cabinet appointments that weren't handpicked by Citigroup, for example, when we're talking about the Obama era. And this $1.9 trillion proposal, it does seem to contain some progressive elements. So where do you see that going? Do you see him towing this line? Or are you more optimistic that he's responding to the growing pressure that we've talked about that's like changed in terms of the Democratic base over the past decade or so?
I think that he's been responsive to left pressure and will continue to be responsive to left pressure. The thing is that he's also going to face right pressure, and he's going to respond to that as well, especially once Trump is out as the big bad and Democrats come in. And maybe, once we've passed the coronavirus bill, there's going to be, I think, a lot of pressure from the usual suspects to say, well, okay, you've just spent however many trillion, however much the final package ends up being. Now we have to kind of dial things back. We've given people a lot of money. Let's not let people get used to the idea of the government regularly handing out checks to people who are in need. We can't sustain that. That's, the debt is becoming unsustainable. You saw Hugh Hewitt, I think, today, try to put this line out there. But there's going to be more of that, much more of that. And I think we're going to be in a place where the policy discussions we're having are going to resemble the policy discussions that we had under Obama in a lot of respects. And so, I think it's going to be up to progressives and activists to make sure that, the movement or whatever it is, whatever we want to call it, the responsiveness doesn't end within the next couple of months, and we don't go home.
I mean, it's going to be fascinating. On some level, I wish, we could jettison 25 years into the future and look back on this moment just from the perspective, I would interview a professor from I don't know what university it would be, and they would come on. They've written a book on the very question as to whether the deficit hysteria comes back right now, because that's going to be a huge tell about our political society. It seems to me this was such a monumental pillar of the Republican Party's over the past, rhetoric over the past 25 years. And in fact, we had an interview yesterday that in some ways indicated it was also part of post-Reconstruction. But this idea of a deficit, if it can make a comeback and it's taken seriously by our political our journalistic, our political journalistic class, it's going to be astonishing. I mean, they jettisoned this so far into the ether, like it was, and the idea that it could come back and just be welcomed as if it had never gone away is going to be fascinating, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree, and I wouldn't be surprised if it did. Honestly, I think that the conditions are kind of right for it, especially if Trump has been eliminated as this kind of people saw him as like a heterodox figure. I think I was always overstated. But if it's true that the Republican Party goes through what liberals on television sort of hope for, excising Trumpism, all the people who are going to be left are kind of as in positions of influence, or who are going to return to positions of influence, are people with very conventional Republican takes on the deficit, on spending, on all the questions they're going to be facing us over the next couple of years. Mitt Romney, if he becomes a person that people turn to for more and more takes and perspectives on American politics, he's going to put out there the same kinds of lines we heard about deficits and spending that we heard under Obama. So, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see a return to deficit hysteria and that kind of politics. I think that it'll be very easy for people to say, well, the coronavirus is this extraordinary situation. We've never faced anything like it. But now, let's say 2022 or 2023, we're through that, and we need to return to economic principles that we hope persist in normal conditions. I think that could happen very well.
Well, I hope people will have the ability to remember like 2017 and 2018. But
that's asking a lot. We're a short memory country.
Hope springs eternal. Osita Nwanevu, writer at the New Republic. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We're going to link to your pieces over there. Folks should really check out the stuff you've been writing. It's
one of the best writers out there right now, I would say.
Thank you, Osita.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back to wrap things up.